Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Invested, my podcast series where I chat with creators, founders, and business leaders making an impact on this world, and today's guest has certainly done just that. In today's episode, I will be sitting down with T J Rodgers. TJ is a legendary figure in the semiconductor industry and Silicon Valley as a whole. In 1982, he co-founded Cypress Semiconductor, a leading provider of embedded semiconductors. Under his leadership from 1982 to 2016, Cypress grew from a startup into a multi-billion-dollar company. He took the company public in 1986 and oversaw its expansion into new markets like USB controllers, Wi-Fi, and microcontrollers. Rodgers served as Cypress's CEO for 34 years until stepping down in 2016 as the longest-tenured CEO among all publicly traded technology companies. In 2020, Cypress completed its acquisition by Infineon Technologies, where it was purchased for close to $9 billion. Rodgers is known for his outspoken personality and management style, so much so that he was coined America's toughest boss by Fortune magazine in 1993. But before Silicon Valley, Rodgers was a Sloan Scholar at Dartmouth, where he graduated in 1970 as the salutatorian of his class with a double major in physics and chemistry. He later served on Dartmouth's Board of Trustees from 2004 to 2012, endowed 2 chairs at the college, and currently holds the title Trustee Emeritus. Rodgers then attended Stanford University on a Hertz Fellowship, earning a master's degree in 1973 and a PhD in 1975, both in electrical engineering. Called a quintessential entrepreneurial company by the Wall Street Journal, Cypress had 27 of its alumni move on to become Silicon Valley CEOs. Rodgers has received multiple awards for entrepreneurial excellence, the most prestigious of which are the Encore Award from the Stanford University Business School as Entrepreneurial Company of the Year in 1988, and the Entrepreneur of the Year Award from Ernst & Young in 1991. Rodgers holds 20 patents, and as a lifelong proponent of free markets, he has testified before Congress 5 times, an act that put him on the cover of Business Week magazine with the title Bad Boy of Silicon Valley. As of April of this year, TJ now serves as the CEO of Complete Solaria, a public solar company where he previously served on the board. TJ truly loves what he does and has the extensive track record to prove it. At 76 years old, TJ still works every day of the week and has fun doing it. In the hours that he is not working, he is tending to the 3 vineyards that he owns, where he is looking to harvest some of the best wines on earth. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with TJ and trust you will too. From lessons learned while building a billion-dollar company from scratch to the fight against censorship of free speech on college campuses, this conversation has it all. And with that, my conversation with TJ Rodgers. All right, TJ, thank you so much for joining us today. I am looking forward to diving into some great questions that I myself prepared, as well as my audience. And I know that they're really looking forward to learning from you and all of your years of experience. But before that, I really wanted to dive into an interesting article that I read about you. It's from 1985. Frank Rose wrote an amazing article. He said that you felt the best way to change the world is to generate possibilities, to put people to work, and to make money. It's been almost 40 years since that interview. Do you think those principles still hold true for changing the world in 2024?
Of course. I mean, what's your option? Elect one of Donald Trump or Joe Biden and then tax people and then give the money out by a political process. I mean, obviously being able to start companies and create intellectual property and create value that people are willing to pay for voluntarily. That is a true free market.
Yeah.
Is the right way to go. It's the only moral way to distribute money.
Yeah. No, totally agree and aligned there. Want to dive into your background. So you finished your doctorate at Stanford and you famously turned down an offer to join Intel because you felt that you wouldn't have the freedom to pursue your projects that you wanted to pursue. Where did this courage come from, especially, starting off your career at a time when a lot of people feel that they need to kind of put in the years, put in the effort before going off and doing their own thing? I'm curious where that courage came from to kind of veer from that traditional path.
Well, my first smart crack would have been it's the courage of ignorance, being able to walk away from a great opportunity.
Yep.
Gordon Moore lived here in Woodside, where this house is. I knew him. He offered me one job, and then a different guy inside of Intel offered me another job.
Yeah.
I knew Intel was a great company. I tracked Intel all the time, not just their technology, but how they ran their company, what their processes were. That was I had 20 or 30 Intelers in the company, and I would talk all the time about what they did. So it turned out that at that time they were working on what later, I think maybe Moore's Law was already said one or two times, but the concept of Moore's Law wasn't a big deal. People didn't know it.
Sure.
Intel was not making CMOS at that time, so they made very high power MOS circuitry, and we're way, way, way up on the learning curve on Moore's Law.
Yeah.
And it wasn't obvious at that time that taking a standard MOS transistor, metal oxide silicon transistor, and shrinking it by a factor of 1,000 and shrinking it by a factor of 0.7 every 2-3 years until you got your shrink factor up to 1,000 was going to be the juggernaut.
Right.
So I invented. So everybody was trying to invent simple integrated circuit. You could get more chips on it. You could get more transistors on a chip and more chips on a wafer. Right. Meaning that a given function, a memory, a computer, whatever, would be cheaper. And there were a lot of different candidates. I invented one of them at Stanford. My invention was complex. It was a little bit weird, and it really did work. It was a technology where instead of MOS transistor is lateral. So current comes in one side, then it's controlled across the center by a gate, and that's the control element. And then it goes out the other side. There it goes out the other side.
Yeah.
So you turn on and off devices, but they have 3 surface terminals. What I did was take the transistors and turn them sideways and downward.
Right.
So their surface aperture was smaller. Therefore, you could get more cranked in.
Yeah.
Into an area. So I had a technology, and to do that, I used a relatively exotic crystal plane dependent etch, where the etching species was hydrazine. The hydrazine is diammonia, and the 2 little hydrogens that stick out like horns off the ammonia, off the nitrogen and hydrazine, match up with certain crystal planes in silicon. That is, the atoms are the same distance apart, and they etch it.
Yeah.
And other times they'll get in there and they don't match up and they can't etch.
Sure.
So when you use that etchant, you actually can etch a perfect crystal plane.
Okay.
And it turns out if you cut the wafer properly, that crystal plane is like at a 45-degree angle to the surface. And then you make your transistor on the surface. And I did. I made memories. I made chips.
Yeah.
When I was at Stanford, I made the transistors myself. And I actually got one of Intel's competitors, American Microsystems, to pay me to try to commercialize the technology. So we were going to kick ass on Intel, right?
Yeah.
And so I think everybody now knows that didn't happen. But there were a couple of years there when the memories we made, and we were trying to break into the memory business. Intel made memories at that time, and they were number one. And we had our angle where we were going to get better. The problem was Intel, you looked at them, and then all of a sudden the transistor was that big. And then you looked at them again, and the transistor was that big. And you looked at them again, and the transistor was the thickness of my fingernail in lateral dimension. And so n squared, right? Shrink it by n squared more transistors. They just won.
Yeah.
The company I started, Cypress. So I turned down a job at Intel. I worked at AMI because AMI let me work on my stuff.
Right.
Then that didn't work. Got my butt kicked. That was 5 years at AMI, and finally realized it wasn't going to happen. And then I went to AMD, Advanced Micro Devices.
Yeah.
Intel's arch rival. Bitter war, lawsuits, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I went to work at AMD because I realized that running a business mattered, and how geeky you were technically didn't matter that much. And I wanted to learn how to run a business. So I learned that at Advanced Micro Devices.
Yeah.
And I turned down a job at Intel before I went to AMI. Then after I left AMI, then I turned down another job at Intel to go to AMD. And both cases, Intel was a juggernaut in the machine.
Yeah.
And in both cases, my opportunities were to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond.
Yeah.
And I've often reflected on that. I know very well that if I had stayed in Intel, I admired their culture, and I think the way they thought. Andy Grove and the way he ran their company, well, I was going to say ran it like my company. The other way around. I knew what he was doing, and I copied a lot of his policies.
Sure.
So I had a chance to make it. And I did, in a way. The Cypress, when it got sold, it was sold for $9.6 billion. That was 2 years, $9.4 billion. That's 2 years after I retired.
Yeah.
So it's the free market, right? And I decided to be an entrepreneur and go against the establishment. And, congratulations to Intel. They did a spectacular job. And they were a national asset that matters to our country.
Yeah.
So it's no problem at all giving them all the credit in the world.
Yeah, well, certainly. Diving even further back into your history, I know you were a star linebacker at Oshkosh for 2 state championship football teams. That's impressive. And then you went on to Dartmouth, where you played football there too. But you also were in a fraternity. So there's kind of that perspective of things, but then you still graduated at the top of your class, second in your class. You were in Phi Beta Kappa, obviously went on to your fellowship at Stanford. I think that's a good epitome of the work hard, play hard culture. And that's something that I can relate to, I guess, from my experience. I was in a fraternity on campus, but then, of course, still worked very hard academically, too. I'm curious just how that mentality really helped you in your career, not just when you were building Cypress, but now. And, even 40 years later, do you still implement that work hard, play hard mentality as you approach your days today?
So my kitchen is right next door. And when I built my house, I actually moved the winery 6 feet in one direction. So the winery is perfectly framed by my kitchen window. So I sit next to my pizza oven, wood burning oven in the kitchen, and look out over the vineyard. And that's where I work.
Yeah.
And just to illustrate the work hard, play hard thing, often my wife will come into the kitchen and say, "Honey, you've been screaming at the top of your lungs for the last 3 hours. Aren't you getting tired?" The translation, why don't you calm it down a little bit? So work hard, play hard is the way I'm wired.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I look back at my mother, and she was wired that way too. Yeah. And I like it. And it turned out, you ask yourself, well, what if you'd have stayed at Intel? Well, if I'd have stayed at Intel, I probably could have gotten a big job. I certainly would have moved up in the hierarchy at Intel. To say you would have gotten the number job is saying way too much, but I kind of went my own way.
Right.
And that, it wasn't accidental. I look at what happened to me, and somebody say, and you can, if I portray it as an accident, everybody will say, "Wow, that's amazing." It was pretty hardwired. So I play football. I like football. I like the strategy of football. I like the courage required to play football. I like the game.
Yeah.
And we were state champions 2 years in a row, and that was in Wisconsin, and that was in the Fox River Valley. And the Fox River Valley goes from Oshkosh, and it ends up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So 3 of the teams in the Fox River Valley were Green Bay East, Green Bay West, and Green Bay Southwest. And Green Bay West, their home field was it's called Brown County Stadium, which later got named, when he died, Lambeau Field. So I played in Lambeau Field against Green Bay high school teams.
Very cool.
And we were good football teams.
Yeah.
So I was sitting in Oshkosh High School, and this guy comes cruising in, short haircut, reps tie, blue Air Force tie, red, white, and blue tie, a light blue Oxford cloth shirt, button down, blue blazer, gray flannel pants. So in other words, he looked like an alien in Oshkosh High School.
Yeah.
And he comes in my study hall, and he walks over and says, "Are you T J Rodgers?" "Yeah." He said, "My name is Earl Hamilton. I'm the line coach from Dartmouth College." And I go, "Where's Dartmouth College?" I had no clue.
Yeah.
So the guy explains, well, it's in the Ivy League. It's one of the nice schools in the Ivy League, and we have good football teams. We don't have football scholarships, but you can get into a really great school through football. So I had a high school teacher, just died, who had her own little fund in Oshkosh, taking care of kids in Oshkosh, for this kind of stuff. She convinced me to go. I was going to go to University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Yeah.
And she convinced me to go. She convinced my parents to let me go. And then I went to Dartmouth. And then, Dartmouth. Everybody's seen the movie Animal House.
Of course.
And Animal House was written by a Dartmouth student who was 1 year older than I am at Dartmouth.
Okay.
And he was a brother at a house called Alpha Delta, AD.
Yeah.
And AD was right across from the football stadium at Dartmouth. And Dartmouth won the Ivy League championship 2 years when I was there. But I only played my freshman year. It was way too important for me to go to school there. Dartmouth was an exceptional school. After my freshman classes, which were big, meant 30, my classes were typically 10 students with the guy who wrote the book.
Wow.
and I took a chemistry major. Then I decided physics I like better, and I took physics major. And then I decided in one course at the end, electrical engineering, and I took a double E course, and I loved it. And I said, this is what I want to do. So I was accepted at Stanford Physics. I called them up, dorm phone, said, no, I don't want to do physics. Can you move me into the electrical engineering department? I want to work on integrated circuits. Secretary goes, it doesn't work like that. You have a fellowship here. If you don't come here, you don't get your money.
Right.
And, here's the number for you. It kind of blew me off.
Yeah.
So I drove from Dartmouth to Stanford having to find a job.
Yeah.
And I went and found a job at Stanford. I went through a couple iterations, but I went professor to professor. I'm a smart guy, really good in physics and chemistry. I graduated at Dartmouth. I was number 2 in my class, all that. And they listened and they go, okay, but there's a lot of really good people at Stanford. And I got the guy who ran the integrated circuits laboratory, Professor James Meindl, to whose foundation I'm a contributor, and they support students. And Meindl, I didn't really understand transistors that well. Now I have a PhD in transistor physics. That's what I got in 1975. But at that time, I didn't understand it. So I asked him how an MOS transistor worked. I just described it sort of for you for the discussion of Moore's law. And he explained it to me carefully. And he went to his book and he pulled out a bookshelf and he said, I'll lend you this book. Go read the first 3 chapters of that book. You'll understand it. So that's what I did. I made transistors in the Stanford Integrated Circuits Laboratory with my own hands. There were no technicians.
Yeah.
I've made millions of transistors with my own hands over a 5-year period. And I invented that technology I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So then I wrote 2 papers. They were back-to-back best paper awards at the International Solid State Circuits Conference. So I got notoriety as a student.
Sure.
So then I kind of could talk to anybody I want. Hence, I got to see the Gordon Moore when I was still just a graduate student, and I ended up doing what I said, following the path. So from getting disillusioned with chemistry, I didn't like organic chemistry. Today, for my personal life, I use organic chemistry 3 times more than any other physics or electrical engineering, anything I do. But I have these skills. I'm interested in everything. And then they just naturally led me to integrated circuits. So in integrated circuits, you've got software, hardware, transistors, circuits, temperature measurement devices, and you put it in silicon. And then you can connect it up and you can make tiny wires, but they're not perfect. So you got to work on them. And eventually you just keep crunching everything into smaller and smaller chips. And that's what I did for my career.
Yeah.
And by the way, you want to talk about work hard, play hard? There's work hard, play hard right there. We talked about Silicon Valley widows. My first wife, I've had 2 wives, and my first wife was a cheerleader for the Oshkosh High School, and she followed me to California to go to Stanford, and we fell apart. She went to Berkeley, and our philosophies diverged to such a point we had trouble not throwing things at each other.
I see. Yeah.
And she got her PhD at Berkeley. So I've done work hard, play hard all my life. I work every night till 8 o'clock, come home, drink some red wine, till I'm ready to go to bed, crash and get up and work on Saturday and Sunday for the stuff you couldn't get done during the week.
Yeah.
And that's because I loved it so much. I think, I forget it. It may have been Jefferson or Franklin, but they said, do something you love and you'll never work a day in your life. There's a quote like that. That's exactly right. That's what I do now. And right now I'm a technologist. I have different kinds of technology that I like, and I'm broad enough that I can kind of get into stuff pretty fast.
Yeah.
And that's what I do now. I have 6 technology companies. They're all working on cool stuff.
Yeah. Well, it seems to, it's amazing. And you mentioned your mother there in that story. I understand she worked in a corps during the war with electronics. And I'm curious just how important that influence was on you in your childhood, just in terms of kind of developing that interest in technology and tinkering with things. How impactful was she in that development?
My mother was a graduate of University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh. She was a teacher. She was a grade school teacher. But during World War II, she got drafted into the Army Air Force. The University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh is the teacher's college of UW system. So if you wanted to be a teacher for a career, you went to UWO.
Yeah.
and my mother went there. But now you dump 5,000 students out, and Oshkosh had the best of the best. All my schooling in Oshkosh, Wisconsin was off the charts good, really good.
Yeah.
My grade school, K through 9, was part of the UWO, and as it was to other grade schools, was as good as Dartmouth is to colleges.
Wow.
So all along I had good teaching, and my mother got drafted because she had to go to another city to teach. She was in the lobby of the hotel where she was resident 5 days a week when she traveled from Oshkosh. And she flirted with a young lieutenant, and the young lieutenant was giving a test to get into the Army. So my mother got the letter. Congratulations, you've passed. Please
Yep.
report to Truex Air Force Base, Madison, Wisconsin. Boom, she was in.
Okay.
Then they sent her to St. Louis University. She learned about the FM radio. Still today is called super heterodyne. She learned how to make and repair super heterodyne radios for World War II. And so when I was a kid, all those books were there in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And when I was like 5th grade, she'd bring out the book and start talking about electronics to me. So yeah, I got kind of a head start.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think something that a lot of parents need to do a better job implementing now, I would say. And yeah, it's like just that passion and that interest, I think, comes through the fact that you're still working every day. You're Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you're still doing what you love. My question to you, I mean, you were the longest serving public tech company CEO, working at Cypress for 34 years as CEO. You're still in a CEO spot now, different company, but still very challenging. Where do you find that energy? What gets you up? I know you said you have that love and that passion for learning and doing what you do, but where do you find that energy day in and day out to just keep performing at the top of your craft?
Well, I'm lucky. It's there, right? I know a lot of people. I'm 76. I know a lot of people that have, they're already chair-bound
Sure.
at that time. The athletics helped.
Yeah.
So when I stopped playing football, I said I wasn't going to get out of shape. So I lived in the hills in New Hampshire, and my dormitory is right on the Connecticut River at a 60-foot bank, very steep.
Yeah.
And I used to run on the banks of the Connecticut River in the summer and on the ice on the Connecticut River in the winter, and then run on the Connecticut and then do sprinting up that 60-foot hill to my dorm. So I kept in shape in college.
Yeah.
I work out 5 days a week today. I live in the hills here in Woodside, the Santa Cruz Mountain foothills, and I run every day, and I got a hilly run.
I'm sure.
And so I keep in decent physical shape, and then I work. So I'm mentally active all the time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And I mean, to still be able to prioritize your fitness and your wellness, even when running large companies. I in that article I referenced earlier, it said you had the habit of running 4 miles every day. And yeah, I believe it. I've been to Santa Cruz. I understand San Jose, that the hills in that area are nothing to play with. So I'm from Florida, where it is nothing but flat. And so I respect that.
Running in Florida, hot humid weather is tough too. I've done that.
That is true too. The humidity, that's a different ball game. But as I was saying, you were at Cypress for 34 years. You now are, complete Solaria. You've sat on several boards. You've seen a lot of different executives through your time. What in your mind separates a good executive from a great executive? And what could students, young professionals like myself, start doing today to help us develop into a great executive one day?
Okay, so I do that. And you said I'm still a CEO. That's not by choice. I got a company in trouble, and my analogy is it's 2:00 in the morning. Somebody leaves a baby on your doorstep in the rain. You take the baby in. So right now I'm a CEO. I've been there, done that. I don't have any desire to do it. But
Sure.
What I do is I train CEOs and I train executives, and we're talking quote unquote young guys. So we're talking 35-year-olds who are technically great and they want to know how to run a business exactly the way that I was trained by the venture capitalists and people that helped me turn from a techie into an executive.
Yeah.
What makes it's simple. People ask me, well, why don't you get bored of their job? And the answer to that question is really the key to the bigger question. I said I never had the same job.
Yeah.
In the beginning, I had to raise money. I had to write. I had to prove that we were going to do something. I had to convince 6 all-stars, 3 of them out of AMD, 2 of them out of Intel, to quit their job and come and work for me for a lot less money.
Yeah.
Then I had to hire Silicon Valley engineers are notoriously unmanageable bunch.
Sure.
And then you bring them in, and you've got to get something done that's really, really got to work. That means it's got to be perfect. They have to have quality standards that are very high.
Right.
So you learn. So that's your first 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Then you run a company. Then it's got divisions. Then you got products. All of a sudden you understand that your products go into machines that are more complicated yet. So go look at routers and things in the communication world.
Yeah.
And today it's AI is the hot new topic. And you have to understand how your stuff works in that. My expertise starts falling off. I understand systems. I understand computers. I program computers at assembly language level. But you got to understand your customers. Then you got to understand business.
Right.
Then you got to, if you're successful, you got to build something that costs $1 billion. Okay, that's a whole new story. You got to convince somebody to give you $1 billion.
Right.
So each level is a different job, totally different job. So
Right.
the one thing that I don't do when I do whatever is required to make the company work, and it's typically something that's screwed up or I'm worried about or hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And as soon as I know how to do it, then I can train somebody else and they can do it. They can move up and I can move on. So that's one thing. CEOs, they do what's required to make the company work first priority.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that eliminates half of them that just want to be rich. That eliminates another quarter of them that just want a business card that says CEO on
Sure.
it, and they're impressive and buy a Jaguar, whatever. And you get down to then you've got kind of the hardcore Silicon Valley CEOs that were technical, still are, but did whatever they needed to do to make their company work. You know, Jensen Huang, you take a look at NVIDIA.
Yeah.
He's been that way for a long time,
Yeah.
and his job has completely changed. So number one is you care more about the company than you do about your own comfort.
Sure.
So I remember many nights staying at work till 7 o'clock. PowerPoint hadn't been invented yet, so you'd have to create your diagrams, put them on an easel, take a picture of them, take
Yeah.
35 millimeter film, run down to the drugstore, get 1 hour turnaround, and get your 35 slides back to give your pitch at the conference the next day. Remember many nights going home late that, and then you can delegate that to somebody. You can have a department, I guess.
Yeah.
I never had, because I would never trust anybody to do my stuff. Point one. And point two, typically I would much rather have another engineer than somebody being an assistant to me in that regard.
Sure.
So you get deeply involved in everything you do, and you really care, and you never run out of things to do. So right now,
Yep.
I'm more interested in finding technologies that are interesting to me, and then getting teams together to bring them to market, make them work, and make them a big deal.
Yeah.
And I'm working on all kinds of stuff. I have a company in Rochester, New York. So if you take a solar panel, it's 1 meter wide and 2 meters tall, so 3 by 6 feet.
Yeah.
And it generates today about 400 watts. So you got sunlight coming in. So sunlight's got 3 different kinds of ultraviolet, then blue, then yellow, then green,
Yeah.
and then out to red, and then infrared. And infrared goes out quite a way. And all of those contribute to solar energy. And it turns out the photons that are the most important are the ones like in the red, the infrared area. They have just enough energy in silicon to cause an electron to go over the band gap, and then it comes back down around the other way. That's where the power comes from. So the blue photons, which are much more energetic, they waste energy because they excite the electron way up here. It burns heat coming down here and then does the trip.
Sure.
But you only get 1 electron times 1.12 electron volts of energy out of it. So the idea is, why don't you take those blue guys and cut them in half,
Right.
and get 2 red ones out of 1 blue one? Then you get twice as much energy.
Yeah.
And they're working on that. And everybody knows about it. It's called phosphors, right?
Right.
So you take phosphors that absorb UV light or deep blue. These are atoms that internal electrons, and then the internal electrons drop back down to the ground state and emit.
Yeah.
And of course, getting them to emit the right frequency and emit 2 instead of 1, that's the secret. So we've been working on that for 3 years and $20 million. And if it ever happens, every solar panel in the world will get better just by buying a better piece of glass to put on the front of it.
Yeah.
And that's one of my 6 companies.
No, that's fantastic. And yeah, it's interesting, just obviously for myself being earlier on in the career, but as you were saying, the art of understanding that training the people below you to do the things is such a big part of the job. And I think as people grow, and they think what got them there is what's going to get them to the next step. And typically you get there through hyper managing everything and being super hands on, but sometimes you need to be a little bit more strategic and growth focused. So really interesting stuff. My question to you, this just came to me. I mean, now that you're in the CEO spot again, and granted, it wasn't necessarily by choice, I'm curious how you're approaching this CEO role, how you approach the team, the leadership, different than when you were at Cypress Semiconductor.
Okay, my CEO job today is a company called Complete Solar Area. It's a $50 million a year solar company, meaning they put solar on your house in California, Texas, East Coast.
Yeah.
It's a classic solar company like SunPower. One of my original companies was SunPower. That Cypress, my company, owns SunPower as a subsidiary, so I got interested in solar.
Okay.
Plus the band gap thing, that I was telling you about. So how do I work with them? Well, I think they tell you I'm not as good a CEO as they expected.
Okay.
Because when you're learning how to do it, then you're talking with them and you're making mistakes and fixing it and trying to do it better. Once you understand how to do something, then you just know.
Right.
And it's exactly like a student in class. You don't have that long absorption time. The professor gets up and he gives you a 55-minute lecture, and
Right.
It comes at you at rocket speed, and you're taking notes as fast as you can. And he's giving concepts that he understands because he's worked on it for many, many years.
Yeah.
And you've got to absorb it quickly. So I'm kind of like that. I'm kind of like the professor. It turns out I wrote a book in 1992 about bringing Cypress from nothing to $100 million.
Yeah.
It was called No Excuses Management. Turns out that book is the ideal book for my new job, which is sort of call me the chairman of the board who's training the executive staff on running a company.
Yeah.
And the book was about business systems in a world where only WordPerfect, which didn't even exist then, but the equivalent of WordPerfect, spreadsheets, and PowerPoint existed. And then you had rudimentary computers. Well, today this computer here has got more horsepower in it than all the computers in the world back when I started the company. But it's a book about how you take rudimentary systems and run a company. And the thing is about the philosophy of what you're trying to get done, and what measurements you make, and what data you keep, and how you work with the data, and then how you make decisions based on it.
Yeah.
So I have a staff meeting that goes 5 hours twice a week. So it's like your long lecture hall.
Yeah.
And then I talk about whatever is the problem. It's the same thing. Whatever they're working on that they care about that we need to work on together. Or I'm trying to build something for the future.
Yeah.
Like, for example, get them ready so they can be a public company if they choose to be if they qualify to be a public company.
Right.
So I'm not a CEO. I do get involved in their decisions, and I do ratify their decisions that the board needs to ratify. So if they want to spend big money, or if they want to take a strategic direction, they got to get board approval.
Yep.
So I work with them on that. That's if you want to talk about the troubles I have, that's one of the big ones.
Sure.
They're getting ready to make a classic mistake, and I'm saying, no, don't do it. And they say, yeah, but I'm young and energetic and smart, and I really want to do that. And they go, Don't do that, you get screwed. And then we go around for a while, and then I scream it, and then maybe TJ's TJ is exactly the way Andy Grove was when TJ decided he didn't want to go to work for Andy Grove.
Yeah. Well, good reflection there. One of the maxims that you used when you were at Cypress was the idea that only the best, you only wanted to hire the best, you only expected the best out of your company. What characteristics did you look in someone that helped you determine if they were the best, if they were the right fit? And again, bringing it back to kind of my audience, what can we do to try to, inhibit some of those characteristics?
Well, I did. I said my hiring strategy was only the best. I gave a lecture. Matter of fact, the last time I gave the lecture on how to hire was yesterday for 2 hours to a company in Lexington, Kentucky, that I'm chairman of, and we're working on bourbon.
Yeah.
And we're working on how not to destroy a tree for every 2 barrels that you make of bourbon, and how to make, but what are the chemistries that make good bourbon whiskey and allow you to use 30 times less wood and make bourbon and still win awards. I'm not a bourbon guy. I'm a wine guy. I live in California, but I got into that. and I was teaching them how to hire. And so it's a business process. It's hard. It's not the buddy system, and
Yeah.
all of that doesn't work. You start out by determining who you need, and that's hard because you'll always need 3 times more people, you'll think, than you can really afford. So you try to figure out who you need. There's a process for that,
Right.
and then dropping out of that, then it says, here's your precious 4 people you can hire in the next 6 months. How are you going to pick them?
Right.
Then it goes through the process of picking them. Turns out that is better subcontracted. The headhunters do this for a living. They have large lists of people. They deal with a lot of people. And when you start describing attributes you want to have in an employee or in a person who works for you,
Yeah.
they're the right people to bring you the 10 candidates. It's your job to take the 10 candidates and pick out the best one.
Yeah.
And who's best is it's not one size fits all. As a matter of fact, my reputation is I have a lot of weird people that are around me.
Yeah.
Because I will find somebody that is, well, I'll give an example everybody knows. Steve Jobs was weird.
Yeah.
Okay, but he was the best. So the point is, you find somebody that's really good at something that's important you need to do. You decided you need to do this thing.
Right.
You find that guy, and then he's the best. And then he's got all other problems, or he doesn't give a shit about money or whatever. And then you got to, if you can, convince him to come in.
Right.
And then after a while, you form teams, and the teams all have different views of what quote best unquote means.
Yeah.
And then those teams find, debate, interview, and bring in people. And eventually, you have a culture. The ultimate is culture. That was the book, the work that came out of Stanford, Built to Last.
Yeah.
One to Many and Built to Last, and the other one was Good to Great.
Yeah, that's Jim.
And
Jim
those books talked about culture. So you do what I describe enough, you get a culture.
Yeah.
If you're lucky enough to get a culture, then the culture, you kind of put it in autopilot.
Right.
So they will bring you good people. They will pick good people, and they'll bring them into the boss. Usually for me to give a sales job, to get somebody that's wanted all over the place across the threshold into our place.
Yeah.
So if you don't have the best, it'll kill you in a startup.
Yeah.
You can be a big company with mediocre people and get away with it. We've all been, I won't name any companies, but you've been in the store, you've been somewhere, you've been unimpressed, and this company's got a lot of people like that. You can get away with it in companies that have thousands, plural, of people. In companies that have 10, you make 5 mistakes, you're deader than a doornail.
Yeah.
So you picking good people and hiring right and putting energy and intelligence into it's a big deal.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned there kind of the power of specialization, finding your strength and being the best at it. Like I said before, a lot of my audience they're young professionals. They're looking where they want to dedicate their life, where they want to follow. And it's a big decision. I'm curious what your advice would be to those ambitious young professionals who are just trying to make a decision for where to dedicate their life's journey. You've obviously just constantly followed your passions, your interests. Would love to just hear some advice to people who are trying to figure out where they can really thrive, and I guess how to reflect on what that might be.
In a different form, I've already answered that question.
Sure.
And I was I went back to Dartmouth in 2004 as a trustee, and I was on the board of trustees of Dartmouth from 2004 to 2012. And as a trustee, I had hundreds of students come up and say, "What should I do?"
Yeah.
And the advice was always the same. It's always easy. What do you like doing?
Yeah.
You need to do something you like to do, because if you don't have passion about what you're going to do, somebody else you're competing with will have passion.
That's right.
And the person with passion will wipe you out, because you want, you want a quote unquote balanced life and all that good stuff. And that person will outwork you and outthink you, and,
Right.
and you're going to get wiped out. So do what you like to do.
Yeah.
And it's not always about corporations, money. Do what you like to do, and then you'll never work a day in your life. Back to the old quote.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I think this is a natural transition, mentioning your time as a trustee at Dartmouth. In the past, you've been a strong advocate for free speech, and you've made comments about the lack of it at certain college campuses. I think it's pretty obvious that has occurred. Why do you think free speech is so valuable, and what can we do as students, as young professionals, as business leaders to combat kind of what we've seen in terms of the censorship and just the lack of free speech?
Well, first of all, it's shocking to me that it isn't obvious to the first order to everybody why that's an obvious question.
Sure. Yeah.
How would I like to be in China, where my house is probably bugged, and if I say the wrong thing about the wrong guy, then I won't go to this university,
Yeah.
or I will be exiled, or Soviet Union, same thing,
Yeah.
or Europe, where I'm a member of the aristocracy, or I'm not a member of the aristocracy. I mean, the point is being able to speak freely, being able to contribute, being able to have different ideas.
Right.
People say, you have you're what's the word I want? You're making trouble of some sort, and the fact is, those are the people who change the world for the better.
That's right.
So it's obvious that you want to be here, you want to be in free speech, you want to be able to say, I think IBM's this or that isn't as good as mine, and I'm going to change it. You want to be able to challenge Intel even if you lose, because you're going to learn a huge amount just challenging them, finding out where they are, finding out what it takes, what it takes to do that.
Yeah.
So to me, it's obvious you have to have free speech. Okay, then in academics, it's always been obvious to academics that they need free speech to pursue their discipline.
Right.
And that's always been true inside of colleges. But what's really interesting is when academics in today's world, when academics decide to have strong views on non-academic fields and enforce them, and that's where you run into the trouble. Where you there's a party line and you have to follow it, and that's really screwed up and It's really wrong. I realized it at Dartmouth. I came in. Dartmouth's one of the few colleges that has truly elected directors. We have a democracy of directors or trustees, and I wrote a letter to my classmates, alums in general. It wasn't by class. And I said, I think we spend too much money at the college. We have too big overhead.
Yep.
We now have more administrators than we have faculty members. What's wrong with that?
Yep.
Because back when I was there, we had really small classes, and Dartmouth was about teaching, and that's what you focused on.
Right.
And I said, we've gone, in those days we used the term politically correct.
Sure.
Today it's called woke, right? So we asked about that problem. I asked about that problem. Part of the board hated me because I said things that I was speaking against the college itself.
Sure.
And one of the things I realized when I was being attacked for my free speech was that I had to do free speech at Dartmouth College first.
Right. Yeah.
And they didn't have it. So okay, the arbiter of free speech in college is called FIRE, F-I-R-E, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Today it used to be called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. And they ranked all the colleges for their free speech, and they still do today.
Yeah.
And they are the arbiter, and they have hundreds of metrics that they use. So they can tell you who's number 393 and who's number 394 accurately.
Right.
They used to have a simple red-green system. So I talked to our president at Dartmouth and said, you guys are ranked poorly. You have lousy free speech. And I said, I see it all the time. In my case, I don't care. I don't need to be liked. That's not one of my things that I have.
Yeah.
But you really stifle free speech, and there's an in crowd and an out crowd. And by the way, when I was at Dartmouth, the in crowd were the conservatives, and the out crowd were the Vietnam War protesters. So the lefties were the rebels, and the conservatives were the state administration that tried to keep a lid on the rebels. Now, power structures flipped, and FIRE's been looking at that for years. So today, I look at our, quote, great institutions, unquote, and they ain't so great. Harvard is ass last in free speech in the United States of America. And this is based on hundreds of interviews, questionnaires, data that shows students, for example, are worried about retribution if they say something is wrong. Students will tell in the various forms of questions, which are fairly scientific and well done. Students will say they're afraid of retribution, so they self-censor. They won't say their views. And that's awful. And it's bad, and universities have done it, and it's not okay. And frankly, I think the product coming out of our universities is not as good as it used to be. It really isn't. The level of diligence the teaching is not as good as it used to be, because we got all these other things we have to worry about. and mere teaching and creating excellence in learning. In many cases, taking a high seat. Look at Harvard. Look at what they talk about. I went to Dartmouth. All right, it's a natural rivalry there. We're the wild guys from the north, and they're Harvard, the sophisticates. And so we always had a kind of a prejudice for it. But all you got to do is walk around the Freedom Trail in Boston. It takes you a day, and you see Harvard was part of the freedom of this country. Period.
Yeah.
And a lot of them died for it. Signing the Declaration of Independence was a death sentence for a bunch of them. Get your house burned sentence for others. And that's not true at Harvard today. The stuff they talk about, they argue about, the meanness that you see coming out of that place is awful. Now they got rid of some people, and I hope that's the beginning of the pendulum starting to come back in the middle.
Yeah, well, you mentioned kind of how Dartmouth, the structure of the board in the democracy, that's something that I've learned about through Bill Ackman with the Harvard board, and just his concerns with that and how they've changed. It was after, I think they wanted to divest from big oil. They changed the requirements, and that now you need way more votes than ever before to even be up for election. It's really interesting just kind of how the system works. But I think it's important to be having these conversations. I had James Fishback on the podcast. He was one of my earlier guests. He's an advisor to Vivek, who of course is a major advocate for free speech. And so it's just a really interesting conversation. And it's not that one side is right, one side is wrong. It's just that there needs to be that conversation. And I think at some of these universities, that conversation isn't allowed to be had. And so,
well, you got to differentiate a little bit between right and wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
If you're talking, somebody's got the left view and somebody's got the right view of some issue, the answer is it's difficult to say who's right and wrong, and who's right and wrong may change over time. Like, when I graduated in 1970, there was a protest against the Vietnam War every week. And it wasn't violent, and we didn't interrupt it, and they did their thing, and they went out and took over the green and all that stuff. But, I was in ROTC.
Yeah.
Why did I do that? Well, the deal was, if you were in ROTC at Dartmouth, you graduated lieutenant, and then they let you alone to go to graduate school, which I did.
Yeah.
And that was my deal. Okay, so I clearly could have been, the flag waving, these commies, they don't love America.
Sure.
Didn't do that at all. Okay, so it's the differentiation. And by the way, in retrospect, they were right. Sure. They were right a lot about Vietnam, and it wasn't worth what we did there. But there's the right of free speech versus the censorship, canceling people.
Yeah.
That one I'll fight about all day long, and they are wrong.
That's right.
Those people who say you can't speak freely and who shun people and cancel people, they are wrong. So there is an absolute right and wrong in the vertical dimension of free speech and not. Whereas the left-right political stuff typically gets all the press.
Sure.
And there is a huge latitude of reasonable thinkers.
Yeah. No, totally aligned there. That's, I guess, I should have clarified when I said right and wrong. But yeah, I think that's it's an interesting thing. And especially for myself being a relatively fresh college grad, and I interact with students daily, it's interesting to see kind of how this is all going to play out. But changing subjects to, I guess, a little bit of a lighter tone right before we have to log off here. I understand you were talking about your whiskey company, the bourbon. You're obviously very into wine. Where did that come from? What kind of inspired that? Is it just that, again, work hard, play hard culture, where at the end of the day, there sometimes is nothing better than a nice glass of wine? And of course, the organic chemistry background can kind of help a bit there too. So would love to just understand a little bit more about that passion in these last few minutes that we have here.
I had my first drink on New Year's Eve of my senior year in high school, and I had a couple beers. And I didn't drink, one, because there was never any alcohol in my house, and two, my mother, who was a handful to deal with, would have killed me or my brother if we had ever come home drunk, ever.
Sure.
So it didn't happen. So then you go to Dartmouth, and I talked before about Animal House, and I told you a brother of Alpha Delta wrote the book, and you've seen the movie.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, having been at Dartmouth, there was an incident in the movie about where a horse died of a heart attack in the dean's office. Never happened. There's another incident in the book where the students went out and interrupted the local parade. That was Farber College in Oregon.
Okay.
That would have been in Hanover, New Hampshire. Never happened. But other than that, in that movie, I had personally done everything in that movie, everything,
Okay.
and that's exactly what Dartmouth was like. So I started drinking at Dartmouth. And that drinking was like frat drinking.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
worked my butt
You weren't
off.
drinking nice wines. Yeah.
No, I did, even at Dartmouth. I mean, you get some Ripple or some real crap, downstairs. So you drink beer and some hard stuff sometimes. Okay, so I started to drink at Dartmouth. That's the point. Then I drove to California. I drove the southern route, Route 66, from the East Coast to Southern California, and I came through some valley down near LA, and they had fruit trees and they had fruit wine, and we went in and tasted the raspberry wine, and oh, isn't this wonderful? No, it wasn't wonderful. It was really sugary crap, but it tasted pretty good.
Sure.
So I got up here. Then I can be from this dining room to downtown Napa in less than 1 hour. I can be downtown San Francisco in 26 minutes. There are other wine districts around.
Sure.
So when I first came here, weekend in California, I mean, it's like going to vacation land to live. And I got into wine country and I started going to all the vineyards. And this is back when Napa wasn't crowded and it wasn't commercialized, and it was fun. BV was a small, Beaulieu was a small vineyard. Martini was a family winery, that kind of stuff. So I got into California wine. Then there was a fancy store in the El Camino Real that sold fancy wine to rich investment bankers. They lived in Atherton, right across the street, little north of Stanford. And these were all the great wines of the world. So I went in there. I had a fellowship at Stanford, and it paid well. And I got a house and all my tuition, all my books, and then I had a stipend, and I could afford a couple of bottles of wine a week. So I went into the store, and the guy said to me, "Why don't you try some French wine?" And I go, "What do I want French wine for? I live in California. I like California wines." Take a look. So I bought a mixed case. My first bottle of champagne, Louis Roederer. My house champagne is still Louis Roederer. I have others now, but that's still my basic Louis Roederer Brut non-vintage.
Yeah.
I bought Bordeaux, I did Médoc, Saint-Emilion. I bought Burgundies, and these are cheaper ones. But I got into French wines, and I really liked them. And I still do today.
Yeah.
So my vineyard, I had 3 vineyards, and I make California Pinot Noir, but I make it in the Burgundian style.
Okay.
And if you take one of my wines and they'll age for 20 years and put it up in, let's say you take my 06 and you put it up with 3 or 4 Burgundies from 06, put bags on them, my wine doesn't get picked up from the French ones. So that's where I'm at. I like, I'm now getting back in my life in a little bit of white, but I like red wines, in particular Burgundy/Pinot Noir, but now I like Bordeaux as well. And I have a great collection that I collected over the years.
Yeah.
And I'm knowledgeable about the wine, but
yeah.
I do French wine and I do California wine, and all things being the same, I'll take a Burgundy any day, a red Burgundy any day of the week.
Yeah. Well, there you go. And the beauty of wine too is that it's a hobby that you can enjoy with others. And the fruits of your labor certainly pay their dividends. So I know we're at time. So TJ, really appreciate the time you spent with us today. I know that all of my audience is really going to appreciate it. I'm curious, in closing, just what can we do to support you on these different life missions? A lot of times we're talking to founders or creators, and it's a little bit more of a straightforward ask. But you mentioned kind of just the free speech. You mentioned just these different initiatives. What can we do to just show our support for your life mission at this point?
Be successful in your own life. So I'm not in politics. I don't like politics. I don't like politicians. I don't give them any money, and I don't watch the news. So there's no party that I have or anything like that.
Sure.
What you can do, what's wrong with politics now, and it's worse than ever before in my life, is that you've got this dichotomy where you got the worst guys on the left and the worst guys on the right, and then they argue with each other and they point out each other's bad characteristics. They tell you how bad America is. What's wrong with us,
right?
And then you have divisive arguments, and then somebody has to lose, and then the newspaper of choice has to pick on the guy on the other side to show that he was really wrong, shouldn't have got elected. Don't listen to that crap. don't get sucked into it.
Yeah.
Vote for merit, vote for freedom, and don't vote to enrich yourself, because I guarantee everybody that is promising you to enrich yourself will make you poorer. Guaranteed. That one I know for a fact. Adam Smith knew that for a
Yeah.
fact. It's don't vote to get something, some subsidy. Like, right now I'm in the solar business. I have been for 24 years.
Yeah.
I was the chairman of SunPower Corporation. It was the first big, important American solar company when it went public. As a matter of fact, my company owned SunPower.
Yeah.
So I've been in solar for 24 years, and we love solar. We do this green, we do that green. It's all crap. You can buy a watt of solar installed. So if one panel is 400 watts. A typical system would be 8,000 watts, would be 20 panels.
Yeah.
In Europe, you can buy an installed system for $1 a watt. In the United States, with all of our subsidies, it's $3 a watt.
Yeah.
So we talk about it, we subsidize each other, and we make everybody's job more difficult with work rules and other rules that are not productive to a well-running society.
Yeah.
And then we try to get elected on solar. I see a politician says, well, we're going to help the solar industry. Turn your back and run like hell. I still can sprint. I'm gone 100 yards away in 11 seconds.
And you're probably, I was going to say, you're doing it in a fast time. Well, perfect. Be successful. We are certainly working on that, and we plan to make you proud. So, TJ, thank you again for joining us. This was my pleasure, and look forward to staying in touch. So, thank you for the time.
Thank you. Appreciated it.